Somewhere in the south of the Netherlands, inside a building that does not appear on most public maps, a machine is being assembled by hand. Not by robots, by people. Specialists who spend up to 6 months completing a single unit. The machine weighs roughly as much as 2 commercial airplanes. It ships in approximately 250 separate freight containers. It costs, depending on the configuration, somewhere between $350 and $400 million. And when it arrives at its destination, a semiconductor fabrication plant in Taiwan, South Korea, or the United States, it takes a team of around 250 engineers to install it. There is only one company on Earth that builds it. That company has never run a Super Bowl advertisement. Its name does not appear on the back of a smartphone. Most people who benefit daily from what it produces have never encountered its brand. But the chips inside every advanced AI server, every flagship mobile processor, every piece of high-performance computing hardware built after roughly 2018, none of them exist without what this company makes. The company is ASML. It is headquartered in Veldhoven, a mid-sized city in the Dutch province of North Brabant. And in early 2026, it crossed $500 billion in market capitalization, becoming only the 3rd European company in history to reach that threshold, after LVMH and Novo Nordisk. Not a consumer brand, not a pharmaceutical giant built on household name drugs, a manufacturer of optical equipment that most of the world cannot name. That asymmetry, between the invisibility of the company and the scale of what depends on it, is precisely where this story begins. The technology at the center of ASML's position is called extreme ultraviolet lithography, EUV. The name describes a process using light at a wavelength of 13.5 nanometers, far beyond the visible spectrum, to project circuit patterns onto silicon wafers at a precision that approaches the atomic scale. To produce that light, a machine fires a high-powered laser at a droplet of molten tin 50,000 times per second, generating a plasma that emits EUV radiation. That radiation is then shaped and directed by a series of mirrors. Mirrors so precise that if they were scaled to the size of Germany, the largest imperfection on their surface would measure less than a millimeter. Those mirrors are made by one company, Carl Zeiss SMT, based in Oberkochen, Germany. ASML owns approximately 24% of that division. The relationship is not a vendor contract. It is a structural dependency embedded in the architecture of the technology itself. No other optics manufacturer in the world has demonstrated the capacity to produce EUV-grade reflective surfaces at the required specification. The supply chain for the most consequential manufacturing tool on the planet runs, at one of its most critical nodes, through a single facility in a German city with a population under 15,000. This is the physical reality behind what economists call a monopoly. Not a market share achieved through price cutting or aggressive acquisition, a technical monopoly built on decades of accumulated physics, precision engineering, and institutional knowledge that competitors have so far been unable to replicate. ASML spent roughly 25 years and billions of euros developing EUV before the first commercially viable machine shipped to a customer. The barriers to entry are not financial, they are epistemic. You cannot simply fund your way to the answer when you do not yet fully understand the question. By early 2026, ASML had moved into the next generation. Its high-NA EUV machine, the TWINSCAN XE5200B, began high-volume shipments to Intel and Samsung. The numerical aperture of the lens system increased from 0.33 to 0.55, a change that sounds incremental and represents something closer to a structural leap. The ability to print features for sub-2 nanometer chips in a single exposure, eliminating the multi-patterning steps that had been compressing yields and adding complexity for years. Intel installed its first unit at its D1X research facility in Oregon in late December 2025. ASML's chief technology officer confirmed in February 2026 that the machines had collectively processed over 500,000 wafers, the threshold the company had defined as proof of high-volume manufacturing readiness. The decision that cost billions, the one made by every government and every competitor that underestimated how long ASML's lead would hold, was not a single boardroom moment. It was a slow, compounding failure to recognize that a technical monopoly, once established at sufficient depth, does not erode on a normal competitive timeline. The city of Veldhoven did not set out to become a geopolitical asset. ASML was founded in 1984 as a joint venture between ASM International and Philips. It operated for years as a competent but unremarkable equipment supplier in a field dominated at various points by Japanese firms, American firms, and later a shifting constellation of both. The EUV program began in the 1990s, progressed through the 2000s with substantial losses and repeated technical setbacks, and did not produce a commercially viable system until 2017-2018. For most of that period, the company's investors were being asked to fund something that looked periodically like it might never work. When it worked, the geopolitical implications did not arrive immediately. They accumulated. By 2019, the United States government had concluded that China's access to advanced semiconductor manufacturing, access that depended at the leading edge entirely on ASML's machines, represented a national security concern significant enough to warrant intervention with a foreign company in a foreign country under foreign law. Washington pressed The Hague. The Dutch government, after deliberation, declined to renew ASML's export license for EUV machines to China. SMIC, China's largest chipmaker, had ordered an EUV system. That order was never fulfilled. What followed was a progressive tightening that eventually extended beyond EUV. In 2023, the Netherlands introduced new controls requiring ASML to apply for licenses before shipping certain advanced deep ultraviolet (DUV) machines as well. Japan joined with parallel restrictions. The combined effect was a layered embargo targeting not just the most advanced tools but the generation below them. By 2025, China's share of ASML's global revenue had fallen from 41% to 33%. The company's CFO, Roger Dassin, projected a further decline to approximately 20% in 2026, not primarily because Chinese customers were being turned away, but because the rush of DUV orders placed before the restrictions tightened had run its course and the pipeline of permitted machines was narrowing. What this sequence revealed was something that had not been fully visible when the decisions were being made. A small country, housing a single company, had become the effective choke point of the most consequential industrial policy rivalry between the two largest economies on Earth. The Netherlands was not a great power. It was not a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. It had no nuclear arsenal, no global military projection capability, no permanent seat at the table where the largest strategic decisions were made. And yet Washington needed its cooperation to execute the central pillar of its technology containment strategy against Beijing. That dependence rearranged, quietly and without ceremony, the informal hierarchy of leverage in the transatlantic relationship. Dutch diplomats found themselves in conversations they had not previously been invited to. Export license decisions made in The Hague carried consequences that reverberated through supply chains on 3 continents. The decision that cost billions, in foregone revenue, in accelerated Chinese domestic development, in diplomatic capital spent, was the original underestimation of where that leverage would eventually concentrate. The term chokepoint entered mainstream policy language sometime around 2022. But the mechanics behind it had been visible in industry circles for considerably longer. A semiconductor fabrication plant, a fab, is among the most capital-intensive structures a private company can build. Advanced fabs routinely cost between $15 and $25 billion. Their construction timelines span years. Their productivity depends on an uninterrupted supply of equipment, chemicals, gases, photomasks, and calibration services. Inputs sourced from dozens of specialized suppliers distributed across multiple countries. Remove any single critical input and the entire facility's output degrades or stops. ASML's machines occupy a specific and irreplaceable position in that input structure. A fab building chips at the leading edge needs EUV tools to expose the most critical layers of the chip's architecture. Without those exposures, the transistor density that defines advanced cannot be achieved. There is no workaround. There is no older process that produces equivalent results. The technical constraint is not a matter of preference or optimization. It is a physical boundary defined by the wavelengths of light. China understood this. Its response after 2019 was not passive. The Chinese government designated domestic semiconductor self-sufficiency as a strategic national priority. funding flows, through state-backed funds, direct subsidies, and directed lending, reached scales that analysts estimated in the range of $150 billion over several years, though precise figures varied across sources and methodologies. The primary lithography equipment manufacturer receiving this support was SMIC, the Shanghai Microelectronics Equipment Group. By late 2023, SMIC had delivered its first 28nm DUV-capable production tools to domestic fabs, a milestone roughly equivalent to where global leaders had stood in the mid-2010s. Then, in December 2025, Reuters published an investigation describing something more significant. An experimental EUV light source assembled inside a high-security facility in Shenzhen, reportedly under the oversight of China's Central Science and Technology Commission. The prototype generated EUV light at 13.5 nanometers, the same wavelength ASML uses. It occupied nearly an entire factory floor. It could not yet print chips at production yields. As of the Reuters report, yield rates were running around 60% against the 90+% required for commercial manufacturing. The gap between a working prototype and a commercially viable production tool is not a gap that closes quickly. ASML's own path from early EUV light source to first customer shipment spanned more than 2 decades. Chinese engineers starting from a different baseline, without access to the accumulated institutional knowledge embedded in ASML's supply chain, face a compounding set of technical challenges that state funding addresses only partially. The optics problem alone, the challenge of manufacturing EUV-grade mirrors without Carl Zeiss SMT, has no documented solution outside the ASML ecosystem, and yet the existence of the prototype changed the strategic calculus in a way the numbers alone did not capture. The assumption embedded in the export control architecture, that China could not develop independent EUV capability for at least a decade, had been written into policy with a confidence that the Shenzhen facility was now quietly contesting. Inside ASML's campus in Veldhoven, the security protocols visible to outside observers have expanded measurably over the past several years. The company has not disclosed the full scope of its protective measures, for reasons that are self-evident. What is documented, or has been reported by credible outlets, includes formal cooperation with Dutch intelligence services, physical security infrastructure at manufacturing facilities that exceed standard corporate norms, and internal procedures designed to compartmentalize access to core intellectual property, specifically the optical systems, the light source architecture, and the calibration methodologies that define EUV performance. The concern driving those measures is not theoretical. In 2023, the United States Department of Justice filed charges against a former ASML employee, a Chinese national, alleging theft of trade secrets. That case was not an isolated incident in the broader record of semiconductor IP enforcement actions. It was one data point in a pattern that intelligence agencies in multiple countries had been tracking and documenting for years. ASML's position created an unusual corporate condition, a privately held company managing intellectual property that multiple sovereign governments had classified as a strategic national asset. The Dutch government holds no equity stake in ASML. It does not have a seat on the board. Its formal instruments of influence over the company run through export licensing, the power to approve or deny specific shipments to specific destinations. But the informal relationship is considerably denser. Conversations between ASML's senior leadership and Dutch government officials on matters of export policy, security cooperation, and diplomatic positioning have been reported as ongoing and substantive. The company, in this sense, operates in a space that corporate governance frameworks were not designed to describe. It is not a state enterprise. Its shareholders are institutional investors spread across global capital markets. Its CEO and board answer to those shareholders in the normal way. And simultaneously, decisions made in its boardroom carry geopolitical weight that few elected governments can match. The tension between those two accountability structures, shareholder returns versus sovereign security obligations, has not produced a public crisis. It has produced a sustained, unresolved negotiation conducted largely out of public view. TSMC faces a version of this tension. Samsung faces it. But neither company holds the position ASML holds, which is not the position of an advanced manufacturer, it is the position of a gatekeeper. The companies that run the fabs depend on ASML for access to the process nodes that define their competitive standing. TSMC's roadmap to sub-2 nanometer is contingent on high-NA EUV delivery schedules that ASML controls. Intel's stated strategy for reclaiming manufacturing leadership, the 14A node, the bet that high-NA EUV would allow it to leapfrog TSMC in the late 2020s, is predicated on machine availability, calibration support, and a technology roadmap authored in Veldhoven. When those customers negotiate with ASML, they are not negotiating from positions of symmetrical power. The high-NA generation currently entering production is not the end of ASML's technical roadmap. The company has described in public investor materials and conference presentations a subsequent generation referred to as Hyper-NA, a further increase in numerical aperture beyond 0.55, targeting process nodes that would make the current sub-2 nanometer frontier look comparatively coarse. The timeline for Hyper-NA commercial deployment extends into the 2030s. The engineering challenges associated with it, including fundamental questions about field size, resist chemistry, and the physical limits of reflective optics at higher apertures, remain subjects of active research rather than resolved specifications. What this means in practical terms is that the architectural dominance ASML has established is not a static condition that competitors can simply target and close. The target is moving. Each generation of EUV technology compounds the knowledge base required to produce the next generation. The institutional memory embedded in the collaboration between ASML and Carl Zeiss SMT, the shared understanding of how to specify, manufacture, align, and calibrate systems operating at the physical edge of what optics can achieve, is not a formula that can be reverse engineered from a prototype. It is an ongoing research relationship with no obvious external equivalent. The broader semiconductor industry has not ignored the single point of failure risk embedded in this structure. Research programs exploring alternative computing architectures, gallium nitride, silicon carbide, two-dimensional materials like graphene and molybdenum disulfide, have received sustained funding from governments and private investors alert to the vulnerabilities of a silicon and EUV-dependent supply chain. Quantum computing programs have attracted capital on the premise, among others, that they might eventually offer computational paths that bypass the transistor scaling treadmill entirely. None of those alternatives are production-ready at the scale and cost required to displace silicon in the applications that currently define the frontier. Large language models, AI inference at data center scale, high-performance computing for defense and research. The substitution timeline, in the assessments of researchers closest to the field, is measured in decades rather than years, which means that the decisions being made right now about which companies receive high-NA machines, in what sequence, under what export license conditions, on what delivery schedule, are decisions about who can manufacture the hardware that runs advanced AI for at least the next 10 to 15 years. The decision that cost billions was never a single signature in a single room. It was an accumulation of choices, by governments that did not move early enough, by competitors that did not invest deeply enough, by policymakers who measured technological risk on timelines too short to capture what ASML was actually building. And it was just as much a choice made by the engineers in Veldhoven, who kept funding a program that looked for most of 2 decades like it might not survive. In February 2026, ASML's chief technology officer told Reuters that the high-NA machines had processed more than 500,000 wafers. That number marked the technical threshold the company had defined internally as readiness for full production deployment. Full integration into customer manufacturing lines, he said, was expected within 2 to 3 years. The machines are already shipping. The order books extend years into the future. And somewhere in Veldhoven, the next generation is being designed. The records of what that generation will make possible have not yet been written.